The mountain man hadn't pointed a rifle at another human being in nearly 15 years. Not since the winter he buried the last person he loved beneath the frozen soil of the high country. But on that bitter afternoon, standing at the edge of the frontier town of Dry Creek, Elias Rourke slowly raised his rifle again. Not to hunt, not to warn, but to stop three men who were laughing while they shoved a young woman into the frozen mud. The men never saw him coming. Most people in Dry Creek didn't. Elias lived high in the mountains above the valley, where the pines grew thick and the wind carried the smell of snow even in late autumn. The townsfolk spoke about him sometimes, usually in quiet voices. The mountain man, the trapper, the ghost who only came down from the hills when winter stores ran low. He preferred it that way. The mountains asked nothing from a man except patience and strength. People asked far more. That afternoon he had come into town for supplies: salt, a new coil of rope, and a sack of flour that would last him until the first deep snows sealed the high passes. Dry Creek sat in the narrow stretch of valley where the river bent south, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled together against the cold winds that rolled down from the mountains. The kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and everyone knew each other's business. Elias had just finished tying his horse outside the general store when the shouting started. At first it sounded like the usual noise of a frontier town: men arguing, boots scraping across frozen dirt, a few drunken laughs. But then came another sound, a woman's voice. Not angry, not loud, just tired. "Please stop." Elias stepped around the corner of the bakery building and saw them. Three ranch hands, big men with thick coats and red faces from too much whiskey, and between them, a young woman struggling to stay on her feet. Flour dust still clung to her dress. A baker's apron hung loosely around her waist. Her dark hair had slipped from its braid and fell across her face as one of the men shoved her again. She stumbled backward and fell into the frozen mud beside the wooden walkway. The men laughed. One of them nudged her with the toe of his boot. "Careful there, Hannah," he said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want the town baker ruining all that fine dirt." Another man snorted. "You'd think she'd stop coming into town by now. Folks don't like looking at her." The woman didn't answer. She simply pushed herself up slowly. Mud clung to the sleeves of her dress. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained calm. "I just came to deliver bread." The third man laughed again. "Bread?" He grabbed the basket beside her and lifted one of the loaves. "Well, boys," he tossed it into the mud, "looks like supper's ruined." The other two roared with laughter. One of them reached down and shoved her again, harder this time. She fell back into the dirt. And that was the moment Elias Rourke stepped forward from the shadows beside the building. The men noticed him immediately, mostly because of the rifle. The long mountain rifle held steady in his hands, not raised high, not threatening, just ready. "That's far enough." The words were quiet, but something about the way he said them carried across the street like a cold wind. The laughter stopped. All three men turned slowly. The biggest of them squinted at Elias. "Who in the hell are you supposed to be?" Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes moved briefly to the woman in the mud. She had gone very still, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. Then he looked back at the men. "Someone telling you to walk away." For a moment, the entire street went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause between the buildings. Then the ranch hand holding the muddy loaf chuckled. "Well now." He tossed the bread aside and stepped forward. "You planning to shoot 3 men over a baker girl?" Elias shifted the rifle slightly. The movement was small, but deliberate. "I won't have to." His eyes moved slowly from one man to the next, men who suddenly seemed less certain than they had moments ago, or going to walk away. The biggest of them studied him carefully now, taking in the worn mountain coat, the rifle, the calm in the stranger's eyes. And then something changed in his expression. Recognition. "Well, I'll be damned." He took a slow step back. "It's the mountain ghost." The other two men looked again, and suddenly the laughter was gone from their faces, because even in Dry Creek, people had heard stories about Elias Rourke, and most of those stories ended the same way, with someone realizing far too late that the quiet man from the mountains was not someone they wanted as an enemy. For several seconds after the mountain man spoke, no one moved. The three ranch hands stood frozen in the center of the street, their earlier confidence fading beneath the steady gaze of the rifle pointed in their direction. Elias Rourke did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. Men who lived long enough in the frontier learned to recognize danger when they saw it, and the quiet trapper standing before them carried the kind of calm that usually belonged to someone who had already survived more violence than most men cared to imagine. The largest of the three ranch hands shifted first. He spat into the dirt beside his boot. Then he lifted both hands slightly. "Easy now," he muttered. "Ain't nobody looking for trouble with the mountain ghost." The second man stepped back, then the third. Their laughter had disappeared completely. The leader glanced once more toward the woman in the mud. Something close to embarrassment crossed his face, though it vanished quickly. "Come on," he said to the others. "This ain't worth it." The three men backed away slowly before turning toward the far side of the street. Within moments their heavy boots faded down the road, leaving the quiet town square behind them. Only then did Elias lower the rifle. He rested the barrel gently against his shoulder. The street remained silent. A few townspeople who had been watching from windows and doorways slowly returned to their business. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. That was the way of small frontier towns. People learned to mind their own troubles. Elias turned toward the woman still kneeling in the frozen dirt. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he crouched slightly and offered a hand. "Ma'am, you all right?" The woman looked at his hand as if unsure what to do with it. Not many people had offered her help lately. Slowly she placed her fingers in his. Her hands were cold, and dusted with flour. Elias pulled her gently to her feet. Mud streaked the sleeves of her dress. Her basket of bread lay scattered across the ground beside them. "I'm sorry about the bread," she said quietly. Her voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. Elias glanced at the ruined loaves. Bread can be baked again. He studied her face for the first time. She was younger than he expected, maybe 25. Dark hair, kind eyes that looked far older than they should have. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. A faint smile crossed her face. Not bitter, just familiar. "I'm usually not alone," she answered. "Usually the whole town is watching." Elias glanced briefly toward the buildings lining the street. Several people quickly looked away. "Why?" he asked. The woman hesitated. Then she bent down and began gathering the loaves that could still be saved. Her movements were careful, patient, like someone used to doing quiet work while others talked behind her back. "My name is Hannah," she said finally. "I bake for the town." Elias nodded once. Elias. She placed the last loaf back into the basket and stood. "I know." That surprised him slightly. Word travels fast in a small place like Dry Creek. She brushed some of the mud from her apron. Besides, she added softly, you're the only man in this valley who doesn't come down from the mountains unless he absolutely has to. Elias almost smiled. You didn't answer my question, he said. Why those men thought they could treat you like that? Hannah looked down at the basket in her hands. For a moment she seemed to be deciding how much truth to give a stranger. Then she sighed quietly. Because this town remembers things, she said, even when it shouldn't. She turned slightly toward the bakery building at the end of the street. Years ago, my father made a mistake. Elias waited. A bad investment, she continued. Lost money that didn't belong to him. Her voice lowered. Some of it belonged to people in this town. The wind moved slowly through the empty street. When he died, she finished quietly, the debt didn't. Elias looked toward the road where the ranch hands had disappeared. So the town punishes you for it. Hannah gave a small shrug. People need someone to blame. She lifted the basket. I suppose I'm convenient. Elias stood there for a moment, studying the quiet strength in her voice, the way she carried the basket despite the mud and the humiliation. Finally he spoke again. You shouldn't stay here. Hannah looked up. Where else would I go? Elias glanced toward the mountains rising high beyond the valley. Snow already dusted the upper ridges. Winter was coming. Fast. There's a cabin in the hills, he said. Warm fire. Enough food for two. Hannah stared at him in surprise. You barely know me. Elias nodded once. That's true. Then he looked toward the mountains again. But I know what happens to people who stay in places that have already decided who they are. The mountains above Dry Creek looked different once a man began climbing into them. From the valley they appeared distant, almost peaceful, but up close, they reminded you very quickly that survival there was never guaranteed. By the time Elias and Hannah reached the tree line, the sun had already begun slipping behind the western ridge. Cold shadows stretched long across the snow-dusted ground. Hannah rode quietly behind him on the narrow trail, holding the basket of bread carefully in her lap. The horse moved slowly between tall pines that swayed softly in the winter wind. She had never been this high in the mountains before. The air felt sharper here, cleaner. Every breath seemed to carry the scent of pine needles and distant snow. After nearly an hour of climbing, Elias finally guided the horse toward a small clearing between the trees. A single cabin stood there. Simple, rough logs stacked carefully together. A thin curl of smoke drifted from the chimney. Elias dismounted first and helped Hannah down. Home, he said quietly. Hannah studied the small cabin with wide eyes. It wasn't large, but it felt solid, safe. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them almost immediately. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, leather, and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A heavy iron stove glowed softly in the corner. Hannah stepped closer to the fire and held her hands out to the heat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elias placed another log into the stove. You can take the bed, he said. I'll sleep by the fire. Hannah turned quickly. You don't have to do that. Elias shrugged slightly. Been sleeping near the fire for years. Don't bother me. That first night passed quietly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like distant waves. Inside, the cabin remained warm and still. For the first time in months, Hannah slept without hearing whispers or laughter outside her door. Days slowly turned into weeks. Winter settled deeper into the mountains. Snow covered the trails and wrapped the valley below in white silence. Life in the cabin followed a simple rhythm. Elias checked his trap lines in the mornings. Hannah baked bread using the small iron oven beside the stove. Sometimes she hummed softly while kneading the dough. The sound filled the small cabin with something Elias had not heard in a very long time. Laughter. One afternoon, Hannah stepped outside and found Elias splitting firewood beside the cabin. She watched him work for a moment before speaking. "You don't talk much," she said. Elias paused. "That a complaint?" Hannah smiled faintly. "No." She looked out across the snowy mountains, stretching endlessly beyond the trees. "It's peaceful up here." Elias leaned the axe against the chopping block. "Mountains have a way of being honest," he said quietly. "They don't pretend to be something they're not." Hannah nodded slowly. "Neither do you." Winter continued tightening its grip on the high country. Food became harder to find. Game moved deeper into the forests. One cold morning, Elias returned to the cabin carrying his rifle. "Elk tracks," he said. "Big one." Hannah glanced toward the heavy clouds rolling across the mountains. "Storm coming." Elias nodded. "I'll be quick." The snow began falling just as he disappeared into the trees. At first, it drifted down lightly, but by afternoon, the wind had grown stronger. Snow whipped across the clearing in long white waves. Hannah waited inside the cabin, feeding the fire and watching the dark forest beyond the window. Hours passed. The storm grew worse. Then she heard it. A horse. Weak. Struggling. Hannah rushed outside into the swirling snow. Elias's horse stood near the edge of the clearing, but Elias wasn't sitting upright in the saddle. He was slumped forward, one arm hanging loosely at his side. Snow had already begun collecting across his coat. Hannah ran through the deep snow and grabbed the reins. "Elias!" He didn't answer. Blood stained the side of his jacket, dark against the white snow. With shaking hands, she pulled him down from the saddle. His body was heavy, cold, but still breathing, barely. Hannah dragged him toward the cabin door, inch by inch through the snow. The storm roared around her. The mountains showed no mercy. But Hannah didn't stop, because the quiet mountain man who had saved her in Dry Creek was now fighting for his life. The storm did not slow that night. Wind slammed against the cabin walls while snow buried the clearing outside under thick white drifts. The mountains had turned cruel. Inside the cabin, Hannah worked beside the fire with trembling hands. Elias lay on the narrow bed near the stove. His coat had been cut open. The wound along his side had bled heavily before she managed to clean it. A deep gash, probably from slipping on the icy rocks during the hunt, or perhaps the elk had fought back harder than he expected. Hannah dipped a cloth into a basin of warm water and carefully wiped the blood from his shoulder. "Stay with me," she whispered. Elias didn't answer. His breathing came slow and shallow. Every few moments his chest shuddered as the cold worked its way through his body. Hannah had never cared for a wound this serious before, but the mountains did not allow panic. They demanded action. She worked through the night, cleaning the wound, binding it with strips torn from one of Elias's spare shirts, feeding the fire again and again to keep the cabin warm. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, but inside the small cabin, the only sound was the crackle of fire and the quiet rhythm of Elias's breathing. Near dawn, Hannah finally sank into the chair beside the bed. Exhaustion pulled heavily at her eyes, but she refused to sleep. Hours passed. Then suddenly, Elias groaned. Hannah sat upright. "Elias?" His eyes opened slowly, clouded with pain, but awake. For a moment, he stared at the wooden ceiling beams as if trying to remember where he was. Then his gaze shifted toward Hannah. "You dragged me back," he muttered. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. Hannah nodded. "You were bleeding." Elias tried to sit up. Pain stopped him immediately. He leaned back against the pillow with a quiet grunt. "Storm still going?" he asked. Hannah glanced toward the window where snow still swirled outside. "Yes." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "You should have left me out there." Hannah frowned. "That's a strange way to thank someone." A faint smile touched Elias's face. Then he opened his eyes again and studied her carefully. "You stayed up all night." Hannah shrugged slightly. "You would have done the same." Elias didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. He would have. For several days the storm kept them trapped inside the cabin. Snow piled high against the door. The world beyond the mountains disappeared into endless white silence. Hannah cared for Elias patiently, changing the bandages, cooking simple meals, keeping the fire burning through the long nights. Elias recovered slowly, but each day his strength returned. One quiet evening he sat beside the window, watching the fading sunlight glow across the snow. Hannah knelt beside the stove, baking fresh bread. The warm smell filled the small cabin. Elias finally spoke. "Why didn't you leave Dry Creek years ago?" Hannah paused, her hands still resting in the bowl of dough. "Because it's my home. They hate you there." Hannah looked toward the mountains beyond the window. "Not everyone." She hesitated, then continued softly. "When I was a girl, there was a flood." Elias listened quietly. "The river rose faster than anyone expected," she said. "Houses washed away. People were trapped." She lowered her eyes. "I helped get the children out." Elias frowned slightly. "Never heard that story." Hannah smiled faintly. "People forget things when it's convenient." The cabin fell quiet again, but something about her words lingered in the air. Far below in the valley, the town of Dry Creek had begun talking again, because 3 ranch hands had returned days earlier with a story about the mountain ghost who had pointed a rifle at them, and the baker girl who had vanished into the mountains. And in small frontier towns, stories had a way of spreading faster than winter storms. By the time the storm finally passed, the mountains had changed. Snow lay thick across the ridges, turning the entire valley below into a wide blanket of white. For nearly a week, the world beyond the cabin had disappeared. But winter storms never lasted forever, and neither did silence. One cold morning, Elias stood near the door, pulling on his coat while Hannah watched from beside the stove. "You're going down to town," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. "Need supplies." He reached for his rifle. "Salt, coffee, maybe some more flour." Hannah wiped her hands on the apron slowly. "You don't have to go back there." Elias studied her for a moment. "I'm not the one they have a problem with." The words hung quietly in the small cabin. Both of them knew the truth behind them. Hannah looked down at the floor. "I've lived with their whispers for years," she said softly. "I can live with them a little longer." Elias stepped closer to the door. Then he paused. "You shouldn't have to." That afternoon he rode down the narrow mountain trail toward Dry Creek. Snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves as the valley slowly rose into view. The town looked smaller from above, just a cluster of buildings beside the frozen river. When Elias rode into the street, people noticed immediately. The mountain ghost had returned. A few conversations stopped mid-sentence. Boots scraped against the wooden walkway. Eyes followed him as he dismounted outside the general store. Inside, the warmth of the stove wrapped around him. The shopkeeper glanced up from the counter. "Well, I'll be," the man muttered. "Thought the mountain swallowed you whole this winter." Elias set a sack of flour on the counter. "They tried." The shopkeeper chuckled quietly. Then his expression shifted slightly. "You hear what folks are saying?" Elias looked up. "Saying what?" The man leaned closer. "About Hannah." Elias didn't answer, but his silence was invitation enough. The shopkeeper sighed. "Town's been talking about that flood again." He wiped his hands on a cloth. "Turns out some folks remembered things." Elias waited. The man continued. "Years ago, when the river took out half the lower street, it wasn't the sheriff who got the children out. It was her." Elias felt something settle quietly in his chest. The shopkeeper nodded toward the window. "Funny how people forget kindness when they're busy blaming someone." Outside the store, the town street looked different now. Not friendlier, but thoughtful. When Elias stepped back onto the street, several people glanced toward him, then toward the mountains behind him, as if wondering whether the baker girl might still be up there. Elias mounted his horse again. Without another word, he turned toward the trail. By the time he reached the cabin, evening sunlight had begun fading across the snow. Warm, golden light spilled between the trees. Hannah stood outside the cabin waiting. She must have heard the horse long before he reached the clearing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the pines around them. Then Elias held up the sack of flour. "Got what we needed." Hannah smiled faintly. "That's good." Elias dismounted and looked back toward the distant valley. "You know," he said slowly, "town's starting to remember things." Hannah tilted her head slightly. "Remember what?" Elias met her eyes. "That you're not the woman they thought you were." Hannah looked out across the snowy mountains. For a long time she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly. "Maybe someday they'll remember." Elias shrugged. "Maybe." He pushed the cabin door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the fire spilled out into the evening air. Hannah followed him a moment later. The door closed softly behind them. Outside, the mountains stood silent beneath the winter sky. And for the first time in many years, the lonely cabin in the high country was no longer a place meant for one man alone.